Have you ever stopped to think about how an ancient story can shake the foundations of what we consider morally acceptable? The biblical Macabre story of Judges 19 will shock you and leave you speechless. Imagine an account so disturbing that it is not suitable for minors, but that offers valuable lessons about human responsibility and the fight for justice. Through this narrative, we are confronted with the harsh reality of what happens when respect for the dignity of others is ignored. In this tale, betrayal, violence, and war reveal the consequences of indifference and lack of leadership. But what if I told you that, even in the midst of so much horror, there is an invitation to reflect on how to act in times of crisis? Get ready to explore how this story might resonate in your life today, prompting uncomfortable questions about your own choices and the society in which we live. It's not just a story. It is a mirror that reflects our flaws and our capacity for transformation. Are you ready to face the truth about Judges 19? Imagine a story so intense, it could easily be in the pages of a modern psychological thriller. This is the case with the account of Judges 19, a biblical episode that, over the centuries, has generated perplexity and discomfort among readers. It is no wonder that this account is considered one of the most disturbing in the Old Testament. The narrative of Judges 19 to 21 sets out a sequence of events that is not for the faint of heart, and frankly, not for minors. This text, in particular, provokes deep questions about human nature and the consequences of our actions. The shock begins with the setting of the context. In a period where there was no king in Israel, the absence of leadership led the people to a state of moral and spiritual anarchy. That already makes you think, doesn't it? What are the consequences of a life without leadership, without firm values, without someone or something to guide us? We are left at the mercy of our own failings, and that's what happened here. The story of Judges 19 is a powerful lesson about what happens when society strays from what is right. This is one of those texts that makes you stop and reflect. Have you ever stopped to think about the importance of having clear guidelines in your life, whether it's a personal goal, a greater purpose, or even following wise advice, like that of Judges 19? This can define the course of your choices. Throughout the video, we will delve deeper into this story and its practical lessons, which may seem distant, but are as applicable as a modern leadership guide. However, you need to be careful, because what comes next is even more disturbing. Just when you think the story can't get any darker, it takes us down an even more macabre path. Are you prepared for this? The next event reveals a series of decisions that define the seriousness of not dealing with the problems immediately. Let's see how a Levite's actions will trigger a tragedy that will leave deep marks, not only in history, but in our hearts. This is just the beginning. The truth about Judges 19 is much more than an ancient account. It is a mirror of human choices and the consequences that these choices bring. As this tale unfolds, it is impossible not to be touched by the relevance it still has in our modern lives. The moral behind these events seems like an eternal reminder that when we stray from what is fair, the price can be irreparable. And that brings us directly to the next chapter of this shocking narrative. Here we begin to see the plot of Judges 19 really unfold. A Levite from Ephraim, a central figure in this narrative, decides to take a concubine, a woman, to be his companion. But right at the beginning, something goes wrong. She is unfaithful to him and ends up running away, returning to her father's house. Now, think about this for a moment. How can the decisions we make in relationships profoundly influence our lives? This Levite chose to run after her, a choice that would ultimately trigger a series of catastrophic events. It's curious how a simple action can take us down paths we would never have imagined. When he arrives at his father-in-law's house, we are introduced to an interesting dynamic. The young woman's father seems to be very happy to welcome his son-in-law, to the point of repeatedly extending hospitality, something highly valued at that time. Imagine this scenario. You go in search of someone you love, but end up being enveloped in hospitality so warm that it seems impossible to leave. This is what happens to the Levite, who ends up staying for several days at his father-in-law's house. Perhaps a reflection of how difficult goodbyes and transitions can be. Who has never found themselves stuck in a situation that they should have left behind, but simply couldn't? There is something deeply human about this part of the story. How many times do we postpone important decisions in our lives because we feel too comfortable? We stand still, without taking action, waiting for the problem to resolve itself. But the reality is, just like the Levite, sometimes you need to step out of your comfort zone to face what's coming. This is what he does, finally deciding to leave and face the journey that awaited him. Here, the report begins to show us something very important. Delay and hesitation often open the door to more serious consequences. If the Levite had taken action sooner, perhaps the events that followed could have been avoided. This is a powerful reminder to all of us about the importance of acting at the right time. Sometimes not taking action is the biggest risk we can take. The interesting thing is that throughout this episode, a question looms. To what extent can we stick to what is safe instead of facing what is necessary? The Levite and his concubine are about to embark on a journey that will change everything, a journey that will take us to a dark and harrowing development. And like any trip, things can take an unexpected turn. The journey home, which should be peaceful, soon turns into one of the most tragic chapters in Judges 19. The Levite, along with his concubine and servant, faces one of the greatest challenges of their journey when they arrive at Gibeah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin. And this is where the narrative takes on a dark tone, as the group does not find hospitality at first sight. Think about it. Have you ever imagined being in a place where no one reaches out, where everyone seems indifferent? This feeling of vulnerability is what the Levite and his company experience when they enter this hostile city. The detail that makes the scenario even more uncomfortable is that, at that time, hospitality was seen as a sacred virtue. Refusing shelter to a traveler was practically unthinkable. But in Gibeah, no one welcomes them except an old man who also happened to not be from there. This small gesture of kindness in the midst of indifference makes us think about how, often, help comes from where we least expect it. How many times in life do we depend on strangers to get us out of complicated situations? And how do we react when we are put in the position of offering help to those in need? This old man represents a light in the midst of the darkness that was about to fall upon them. But, as we will see, a light is not always enough to dispel total darkness. They are welcomed by this kind man, but little did they know what was coming. In our lives, we often have a false sense of security, thinking that the worst is over. But, like the Levite, we must always be alert, as real challenges can arise when we least expect them. There is something deeply ironic here. The Levite left an environment of excessive hospitality in his father-in-law's house, and now faces the opposite extreme in Gibeah. It's as if life is showing you two sides of the same coin, and this sudden change of scenery makes us question how we deal with life's ups and downs. When we find ourselves in uncomfortable situations, do we tend to complain or look for solutions? The Levite thought he had found refuge, but his night was just beginning. What follows is a powerful warning about how seemingly simple situations can turn into unforeseen tragedies. They thought they had found safety, but the doors of darkness were about to open, and, like the Levite, we often believe that things are under control until we are surprised by the unexpected. What happened that night in Gibeah would forever change the history of Israel, but that dark turn was yet to come. The atmosphere of Gibeah soon turns into a nightmare. In the dead of night, perverted men from the city surround the house where the Levite and his concubine are staying. They demand that the Levite be handed over to them to satisfy their depravities. It's a horrible moment, a true test of courage and morality. Here, we are faced with a disturbing question. What would we do in such a pressured situation? How can we act when our integrity and the lives of others are at risk? The Levite, in an act of despair and dehumanization, decides to hand over his concubine to men, as if she were an object, instead of recognizing her humanity. This selfish act not only exposes the fragility of our choices under pressure, but also causes us to reflect on how we can fail to stand up for what is right when we are surrounded by fear. In making this decision, The Levite fails to see the gravity of the situation and the life he is sacrificing. Morality can easily be distorted in times of crisis. As the concubine is brutally abused throughout the night, the horror of what is happening goes beyond the physical. This is complete dehumanization. It is as if human dignity was set aside in the name of desire and savagery. As we reflect on this moment, we may ask ourselves, what does it mean to respect human dignity in a world that seems so callous? This is an issue that we must take into our own lives and communities, as indifference can turn into complicity. However, the Levite, who seemed to be in control of his life, is about to face the consequences of his actions. He becomes a tragic figure, not only for having lost his concubine, but for having contributed to the degradation of humanity. When he finally finds the concubine dead, it is not only a tragic ending, but a reflection of his choices and the society that surrounded him. Just like the story of the Levite, many of us face times when our decisions can have a profound impact on others. This horrific event in Gibeah is a grim reminder of human nature and how a lack of empathy can lead to dire consequences. The narrative is not just about a crime, but about the implications of our choices, which can ultimately define who we are. As the story progresses, we ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go to protect our own interests? What is about to happen in response to this tragedy will shape Israel's future in ways no one could have imagined. After the night of horror in Gibeah, the Levite finds his concubine dead, and this revelation is a devastating blow. In an act of desperation and revenge, he makes the horrifying decision to cut her body into 12 pieces, sending each one to the tribes of Israel. This grotesque act is not only a form of protest, but also a call to action, an attempt to make others realize the gravity of what has occurred. Here, we are faced with a harrowing question. How far are we willing to go to have our pain heard and acknowledged? This brutal scene is a powerful symbol of outrage and the fight for justice. The Levite hopes that the representation of the horror that occurred in Gibeah will provoke a response from the tribes, but it also leads us to reflect on the way we deal with pain. Often, in moments of tragedy, the need to be heard leads us to actions that could be considered extreme. It is essential to question how we express our outrage and how we can find more constructive ways to demand justice. The Levite's message resonates with the tribes of Israel, who are shocked to receive the pieces of the body. The collective reaction turns into a call for responsibility. This leads us to wonder, how does society respond to crime and injustice? Are we willing to unite against evil and protect human rights? Outrage is a powerful engine, but we must channel it in ways that promote healing and unity, not division. As the outcry and pain spreads among the tribes, we are forced to confront our own morality. What would be a fair response to a tragedy of this magnitude? Instead of promoting a cycle of violence, the story encourages us to seek solutions that are based on compassion and reconciliation. After all, what follows this tragedy becomes a question of collective responsibility. How do each of us position ourselves in the face of injustice? The consequences of the Levite's act reverberate in the history of Israel and mark a turning point. Not only did he lose his concubine, but he also became a catalyst for a conflict that would result in a devastating civil war. It's a stark lesson in how actions motivated by desperation and pain can have far-reaching repercussions. And as the narrative progresses, the question remains, what will be done in response to this tragedy? The decisions that follow will have profound impacts on future generations. The repercussions of the Levite's horrendous act are profound and devastating. The indignation that spread among the tribes of Israel results in a call for war against the tribe of Benjamin, who refused to hand over those responsible for the crime. The escalation of this conflict is emblematic of the cycle of violence that often begins when the voices of pain and injustice are not heard. Here, we can reflect on how the search for justice can easily turn into revenge, leading to a spiral of destruction. As the armies of Israel march against Benjamin, the war intensifies. The battle scenario is grim, and the story reveals that thousands of lives are lost. This tragic development is a grim reminder of how a lack of communication and the inability to resolve conflicts peacefully can lead to catastrophic results. And the question that cannot help but be asked is, how can we learn to prevent our own conflicts from turning into wars? Are we ready to talk instead of fight? The death toll rises rapidly, and Benjamin's tribe is nearly wiped out. Only 600 men survive, which leads us to ponder the fragility of life and the importance of seeking solutions that promote peace, even in times of great anguish. This story of tragedy and death is an invitation to reflect on how we choose to act in the face of the injustices we witness. Are we ready to be agents of change, or do we continue to perpetuate the cycle of violence? Furthermore, this devastation is not only a loss of life, but also a loss of identity for the tribe of Benjamin. With such a small number of survivors, the fight for survival becomes even more crucial. This situation leads us to consider, how does each of us face the consequences of our actions and decisions? Benjamin's story is a lesson in resilience and the ability to rebuild after destruction. We can draw inspiration from this tragic event and reflect on the importance of solidarity and mutual support in times of crisis. As survivors struggle to piece their lives back together, it's undeniable that this story holds valuable lessons about collective responsibility and the importance of treating each other with dignity and respect. Tragedy teaches us that even when pain and loss are unbearable, we still have the ability to choose compassion over revenge. But as we look ahead, the question remains, how will this history of violence and loss shape the future of the tribes of Israel? The story that unfolds in Judges 19 to 21 is rich in moral lessons that resonate through time. One of the main messages that emerges is the importance of individual and collective responsibility. The Levite, by not protecting his concubine, reflects the negligence that we often see in our current society. When we fail to defend those who are vulnerable, we create an environment where injustice can thrive. This call for responsibility is not just limited to violence, but extends to how we treat others in our everyday lives. How can we become more proactive in defending human dignity around us? Another crucial aspect is the importance of respect for human dignity. The brutality faced by the concubine is a painful reminder that when we set aside respect for others, the results can be devastating. In our modern lives, this lesson invites us to reflect on how we treat those who are different from us. It is essential to cultivate empathy and understanding in such a divided world. What steps can we take to build a more inclusive and respectful environment in our communities? A lack of leadership is also a central theme that permeates this narrative. History shows us how the absence of an authority figure who promotes justice can lead to moral collapse. In many contexts, we are called to take on leadership roles, whether at home, at work, or in our communities. This implies being the voice that defends justice and promotes collective well-being. The question is, how can we become more effective leaders who are sensitive to the needs of others? Furthermore, the narrative of Judges warns us about the consequences of departing from divine principles. When people ignore moral and spiritual guidelines, the result can be a decline in ethical standards. This reflection is an invitation to examine our own values and decisions. What principles guide our daily actions, and how can we strive to align our lives with a greater purpose? It is essential to consider how spirituality can guide us in times of uncertainty and challenge. Finally, the story of Judges presents us with an opportunity for ongoing learning. Each of the lessons, from responsibility to human dignity, invites us to create a more just and humane future. Thus, as we look at the tragic events that occurred, we are challenged to make choices that honor the lessons learned. Are we willing to take responsibility for our actions and build a world where justice and compassion are the pillars of society? As we reflect on the powerful story of Judges 19, we are invited to apply the lessons learned to our daily lives. Responsibility, respect for human dignity, and the importance of leading fairly are aspects that we must actively consider. What actions can you take to ensure everyone around you is treated with the dignity they deserve? How can you become an advocate for justice in your community? Think about the changes you want to see in your life and in the world. This is the time to act. By incorporating these principles into your routine, you can not only impact your life, but also inspire others to do the same. If you want to continue exploring these deep and transformative truths, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let's deepen this knowledge together and work for a more just and humane future. Are you ready to take the next step and change your perspective?